If you this morning feel weak and helpless and empty and inadequate and unworthy, this message, this text might land on you as good news.
In this episode of Light and Truth, John Piper demonstrates from Acts 17 how worshiping God is precisely what we need in our helplessness. This sermon was originally preached at Bethlehem Baptist Church on November 23rd, 1997.
One of the most exciting parts of the Bible is the book of Acts. And it's written by a doctor, a physician named Luke. And Luke was a fellow traveler of the Apostle Paul. And the Apostle Paul probably heard Jesus preach in person when he was on the earth. We know that he was educated in Jerusalem during the life of Jesus, and we know that he was standing there listening to the message of the first martyr named Stephen. And in fact, Luke tells us in the book of Acts that he was consenting to Stephen's death. In other words, he was very glad that Stephen was being stoned to death as the first Christian martyr, just a few months or perhaps a few years after Jesus had died and been raised. So this man, Luke, who wrote the Acts of the Apostles, is very, very closely tied in with Jesus of Nazareth, accompanied and was probably the personal physician of the Apostle Paul, who had seen Jesus face to face and who had been there during the martyrdom of the first man who died because of his faith. This Apostle Paul hated Christianity. He wasn't yet an apostle. And why he hated Christianity is a very important question, because a change came into his life where he ceased to hate Christianity and began to lay his life down for Christianity. Why did he hate it so much, and what happened to him? He was on his road to Damascus to find Christians. He lived in Jerusalem, and he was moving from Jerusalem in Israel up to Damascus in Syria to find Christians, to persecute them, bring them back, put them in prison in Jerusalem. And on that road, something absolutely stunning and supernatural happened to him. A light which he couldn't explain, just like this one shining into my face here, making it hard for me to see you, probably 1,000 times brighter, landed on him, blinded him for 3 days, and behind it a voice that only he understood, though the others heard the sound, said, "Saul, Saul," that was his other name, "why are you persecuting me?" And Paul said, "Who are you, Lord?" And the voice came back, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." And Paul at that moment felt his whole life on the edge of collapse. Everything he had devoted himself to seemed to be called into question at that moment. Because Paul had given himself to a way of salvation, a way of getting right with God, that when he heard Jesus teach and when he heard Stephen, that first Christian martyr, preach, it was so different than the way of getting right with God that he believed and that he had devoted himself to. Paul had always considered himself a strong Pharisee, the most rigorous group of Jews that there was. He took the law of Moses, he put it on like you put a yoke on an oxen, and he plied himself with all his might to keep the law of God and demonstrate to God that he could serve him and show that he was worthy to be accepted and to be brought into eternal life. That was not the message he heard Christians preaching. And he hated their message, because if their message was right, his whole life was built on sand. He had given himself to a pipe dream. His whole boast, his significance was going down the tubes. And here on the Damascus Road is the living Christ, alive from the dead, speaking out of an inexplicable light, saying, I am the one you are persecuting. That was a crisis. So he goes on into Damascus blind and sits for 3 days pondering whether there's anything left to live for. And a man comes named Ananias, appointed by the Lord to tell him the truth. And when Ananias comes and lifts his voice, the scales, as it were, fall from Paul's eyes. He becomes a Christian convert, and for the rest of his days suffers beautifully for the cause which he once hated with all his might. So the question I have this morning is, what was this message? What was this word, this reality that he had picked up probably in the teachings of Jesus? He had definitely picked it up from Stephen and wanted Stephen dead because of it, because it called his own boast, his own life, his own way of salvation into question. I want to know with you this morning, what was that? What is the Christian gospel? What's the meaning of Christianity that would cause a man to hate it so much and then love it so much that he would lay down his life for it? Now, I'm going to read for you a sermon that Paul preached a few years later. It's just a little short sermon. It takes about 3 or 4 minutes to read. And it comes from the book of Acts, chapter 17. Just listen and pretend that you are hearing this message from the Apostle Paul himself as you stand in Athens at about, say, the mid-50s, say 20 years after Jesus has died. Paul has been serving him for some time now. Only a new situation has arisen. He has come not into a synagogue this time where he was used to preach to Jews. He has come into the philosophical court, as it were. The people who were the intellectuals of the day, the people of Athens, what would he say to them about Jesus? And would he tip his hand so that we this morning can read this sermon and find out what it was about Christianity in Paul's mind that was so at odds with his former life as a Pharisee that made him hate Christianity, fear that it might be true, be blind, be converted, and then suffer for years because it is true. What was it? I'm going to start reading at verse 16 of Acts chapter 17. Now, while Paul was waiting in Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was observing the city full of idols. So he was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews, that's where he starts, and the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be present. And also some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him, and some were saying, what would this idle babbler wish to say? Others, He seems to be a proclaimer of strange deities because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection. They took him and brought him to the Areopagus, Mars Hill, the great place of the debates, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is which you are proclaiming? For you are bringing some strange things to our ears, so we want to know what these things mean." Now all the Athenians, Luke puts this in, all the Athenians and the strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new. They loved newness. So Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, "Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' Therefore, what you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and all things in it, since He is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands." Now mark this next verse. "Nor is He served by human hands as though He needed anything, since He Himself gives to all men life and breath and all things. And He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God if perhaps they might grope for Him and find Him, though He is not far from each one of us. For in Him we live and move and exist, as even some of your own poets have said, for we are also His children. Being then His children, the children of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all people everywhere should repent, because He has fixed a day in which He will judge the world in righteousness through a man He has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising Him from the dead." Now that's where they cut Him off. "Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer, but others said, 'We shall hear you again concerning this.' So Paul went out of their midst. But some men joined him and believed, among whom also was Dionysius the Areopagite, and a woman named Damaris, and others with them." This is the essence, I believe, of the message that Paul hated in Christianity. The God who made the world and all things in it, since He is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is He served by human hands as though He needed anything, since He Himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. Just take verse 25 and let it sink in. God is not served by human hands as though He needed anything. This is what we've put on your pen. God cannot be served, but loves to serve. Now that's very bad news and very good news, depending on what you feel like this morning. And Paul knew how he felt, and early on in his life, this was not good news. If you feel strong and self-sufficient and morally in sync with God and able to serve Him and make independent contributions to God and His work, This is bad news. God is not served by human hands as though He needed anything. In other words, God is self-sufficient. So self-sufficient that we can't make any contributions to Him. We can't improve upon Him. Who has ever given a gift to God that He should be repaid? The Apostle Paul said in another place. And so if you come to God with the mindset that I'm serving you, I'm showing you that I'm adequate, I will negotiate you for a place in your eternity, and this message comes to you, then your whole life is called into question. Well, if I can't serve you, then how in the world am I supposed to relate to you? How am I supposed to get right with you? How am I supposed to know that it's okay between me and you? What am I supposed to do to get into your favor and into your heaven? And Paul didn't have a clue. He just knew he hated this message. It called his whole ground of boasting into question. As a Pharisee, he said in the book of Philippians and the book of Galatians, I have excelled beyond all my contemporaries in the keeping of the law. I am a Pharisee of the Pharisees. And here comes this Christian message, and he begins to pick it up while Jesus is still on the earth. And then he hears it in Stephen's speech. God cannot be served. He is a fountain, and out of Him flows grace and life. And if you're ever going to get right with Him, it will not be by working for Him. And Paul's whole life comes crashing down on the Damascus road. It's as though you spend your whole life doing aerobic leg exercises to get your thighs strong and your calves strong for climbing and jumping and running, only to discover that the last contest of the universe is hang gliding. Which it is. So the self-sufficiency of God did not come to Paul as good news at first. And it may not land on some of you as good news. I don't know what kind of moral, upright people there are in this room. Some may feel very, very self-sufficient and that you have a lot to give to God and that He certainly would respond in favor and reward you with a wage that would be eternally satisfying. But my guess is that this room has a lot more people in it of another kind. And so let me just mention this is incredibly good news if you feel weak. God is not served by human hands as though He needed anything, since He Himself is the giver. We're not the giver, folks. He Himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. So if you this morning feel weak and helpless and empty and inadequate and unworthy, this message, this text might land on you as good news. That He's the kind of God, the God who made the heavens and the earth, is the kind of God who will not negotiate. He does not receive works that can earn wages. He will preserve for Himself the all-glorious position of giver, giver, forgiver. Because when that is His position, He gets the glory and you get the blessing. Bad news to the strong, good news to the weak.
This is Light and Truth, God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. Thank you for listening. On our next episode, John Piper will preach a sermon titled Served by Jesus in our series, What is True Worship? I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.